Last night, Evelyn Cross sat alone in her seaside mansion, listening to the storm outside and remembering the cruel words her daughter-in-law had spoken. For years, she had quietly paid for her son and his wife's glamorous life, but one mocking comment shattered the illusion forever. By dawn, Evelyn had made a secret decision that would change everything, cutting off every card and every account they depended on. The next day, her son called in panic from the most expensive restaurant in the city, humiliated when all their cards were declined. What followed was a battle of manipulation, betrayal, and shocking discoveries that revealed just how far greed can drive those closest to us. But it was also the beginning of Evelyn's fight for her dignity and independence. If you enjoy powerful life stories like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And now let me take you into the story of how one stormy night turned a quiet mother into the keeper of her own freedom. Evelyn Cross had lived in Hollowcliff Manor for nearly half a century, a sprawling stone mansion perched high above the sea. The house stood like a sentinel on the edge of the cliffs, battered by winds and waves that roared endlessly below. Time had left its marks on the place. The shutters creaked when the gales swept in from the ocean. The roof groaned under the weight of salt and rain. The gardens, once carefully trimmed by her husband's hand, had grown wild and tangled, as if they too sensed that the keeper of this house now walked alone. It was not loneliness that troubled Evelyn most, though. It was the feeling that her home, her savings, and her very life had been turned into a stage for other people's comfort. Since the death of her husband, she had become the silent benefactor of her son Adrian and his elegant wife Selena. What began as small acts of support had grown into something monstrous, an endless stream of money flowing from her accounts into their hands. They never asked with shame. They asked as if it were their right, and she, still raw from grief, gave without protest. Adrian was her only child, the bright boy she had once read stories to in the library's oak-paneled rooms. She remembered his voice as a child, eager and curious, asking her about the mysteries of the world. But now, at 36, his voice carried only demands. When he called, it was never to ask how she felt or to check if she needed anything. It was always about rent or a bill or a sudden opportunity that required a loan. Selena, graceful and sharp-tongued, always stood behind him like an actress delivering rehearsed lines. They needed a vacation to clear their minds. They needed new clothes to keep up appearances. They needed a better car for safety. Evelyn nodded and paid. The truth was that the manor itself had become a prison built by her own generosity. Each room held memories of her sacrifices. The dining hall echoed with dinners she had paid for but never attended. The guest rooms stood empty while Adrian and Selena stayed in resorts she had funded. Even the library, once her sanctuary, seemed haunted by the lists of expenses she kept scribbled on loose sheets of paper. She told herself she was helping her family survive, but somewhere deep inside she knew she was helping them live a life they had not earned. Outside, the sea crashed against the cliffs with a violence that matched her inner turmoil. Hollowcliff Manor had always seemed eternal, but Evelyn had begun to wonder if she was the one crumbling, not the house. She thought of the countless checks she had signed, the transfers she had approved. Over the years, hundreds of thousands had slipped through her fingers. Her own desires had withered, replaced by their endless needs. She had not taken a holiday in over a decade. She had not bought herself a new dress in years, and still they asked for more. That evening, as the storm rolled in, Evelyn stood at the high windows of the drawing room, looking down at the angry waves. The wind rattled the glass like a warning. She thought of Selena's last message, a casual remark about how the bathroom tiles in their penthouse were outdated and needed replacing. The price she mentioned was more than Evelyn had once earned in a year at the library. She felt her hands tremble, not with weakness, but with something she had not felt in a long time: anger. Adrian and Selena lived like aristocrats in the city, their penthouse filled with glass and steel, their evenings consumed by glittering parties. They loved to parade their wealth before others, but Evelyn knew it was not their wealth at all. It was hers. Her husband had worked his whole life to provide a home and savings that would keep them safe in old age. And now that treasure had been turned into champagne designer gowns and fleeting luxuries that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Evelyn could not recall when exactly she had stopped saying no. Perhaps it was after her husband's death when her grief made her vulnerable. Perhaps it was after Adrian lost his job and she could not bear to see him struggle. But the truth pressed heavily on her now. She had enabled their every whim, and in doing so had erased herself. The house seemed to sense her thoughts that night. As she walked the long corridor toward her bedroom, the portraits of her ancestors stared down from their gilded frames, their eyes filled with stern judgment. She paused before the painting of her late husband. His calm gaze seemed to ask her the question she had avoided for years. When would she stop sacrificing herself for those who gave nothing in return? The storm intensified. Lightning flashed across the sea, illuminating the cliffs in ghostly light. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, her heart pounding with the weight of realization. For years she had been nothing more than a bank account with a name, a shadow financing, a life she was never allowed to share. And yet in the silence of her bedroom, with the storm beating against the windows, something inside her began to stir. She thought of Adrian's laugh, sharp and careless, when Selena made her little jabs. She thought of the way Selena looked at her, not with respect, but with the cold calculation of someone assessing a resource. She thought of her own silence, her own complicity, and she knew then that silence had to end. Evelyn stood, her reflection caught in the tall mirror near the window. The woman who looked back at her was not weak. She was older, yes, her hair silver, and her hands lined, but her eyes burned with a clarity she had not seen in years. The storm outside was no longer a threat. It was a mirror of her own gathering resolve. Hollowcliff Manor had been a house of shadows for too long. It was time for light to break through. Evelyn felt it rising within her, a certainty as fierce as the storm. The next time Adrian and Selena came to her with their charming requests and false smiles, they would not find the same woman waiting. What Evelyn did not yet know was that the mask of civility her family wore was about to slip completely. And when it did, the shadows in Hollowcliff would grow darker than she had ever imagined. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a sky that was washed clean and a sea that shimmered under pale light. Evelyn Cross moved through the halls of Hollowcliff Manor with a calm determination. Something had shifted inside her during the night. She no longer felt like a woman weighed down by guilt and obligation. Instead, she felt like a sentinel who had just realized her own power. She dressed in a simple navy gown, pearls at her throat, and prepared for the dinner that evening, a dinner that would reveal more than she could have expected. Adrian and Selena had invited guests to Hollowcliff before, but this night carried a different weight. Evelyn had received their message the week prior. They wanted to bring a small circle of friends to the manor, friends who were eager to see the grand old place where Adrian had grown up. Evelyn had not protested, she rarely did. Hosting these evenings had always been her silent role. She provided the house, the wine, the food, and they provided the laughter, the polished lies about their success, and the thinly veiled barbs about how fortunate they were to have Evelyn around. By sunset, the dining room glowed with candlelight. The heavy oak table, polished until it gleamed, was set with the silver service that Evelyn's husband had cherished. The guests arrived in expensive coats and whispered admiration at the grandeur of the house. Adrian smiled broadly as if he were the master of Hollowcliff. Selena drifted through the room with effortless grace, her gown shimmering like liquid gold, her laughter carrying over the clinking of glasses. Evelyn sat quietly at the head of the table, her hands folded neatly, watching it all unfold. She noticed how Adrian leaned into his friends, boasting about their new penthouse in the city. She heard Selena recount tales of their last holiday abroad, leaving out the truth that every trip had been funded by the woman who now sat silently at the head of the table. The guests nodded, impressed, and Evelyn felt the familiar ache of invisibility pressing against her ribs. Dinner was served. Between courses, the conversation grew more careless, loosened by wine and pride. One of Selena's friends asked lightly how they managed to balance such a lavish life with all the stress of the modern world. Selena smiled, her lips curling into something cruel. "Oh, it is not as hard as you think," she said. "We have Evelyn. This house, this lifestyle, it all still stands because she pays for everything. The truth is, she is only good for keeping the bills from piling up." For a moment, the room fell silent. The guests glanced at Evelyn, unsure whether to laugh or look away. The candles flickered, shadows stretching across the walls. Evelyn felt her stomach turn cold, as if the storm outside had returned and now raged within her chest. Adrian broke the silence with a laugh, a full, careless laugh, as if his wife's words were the funniest he had ever heard. His eyes did not flicker with shame or apology. He looked at Evelyn and laughed. Evelyn did not move. She sat perfectly still, her face calm, her heart pounding. The insult had been delivered like a dagger, sharp and deliberate. It was not a slip of the tongue. It was truth laid bare, spoken without fear. In that moment, she saw them both with absolute clarity. She was not their mother, not their elder, not the keeper of a legacy. She was a bank and nothing more. Her guests, perhaps out of politeness, quickly changed the subject. Selena poured more wine. Adrian leaned back in his chair, still smiling. But Evelyn did not hear the new conversation. The words already spoken echoed in her mind, repeating with each beat of her heart. Only good for paying. Only good for paying. When the evening finally ended and the guests drifted out into the night, Evelyn remained seated in the dining room. The candles had burned low, leaving the room cloaked in shadows. Adrian and Selena gathered their coats, too busy with their own chatter to notice the storm building behind Evelyn's calm expression. "Mother, that went well, did it not?" Adrian said, casually adjusting his tie. Evelyn did not answer. She only watched them leave their figures swallowed by the darkness of the night. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm had been. Evelyn rose slowly and walked to the window, gazing out at the cliffs. She felt no tears. She felt no sorrow. Instead, she felt something sharper, cleaner. Rage, yes, but also clarity. For years she had excused their behavior, convinced herself that their dependence was her duty to bear. But now the mask had slipped, and she had seen their faces without disguise. The wind rattled the glass as she stood there. Her reflection looked back at her, stern and unyielding. She thought of all she had given, the years of sacrifice, the countless checks signed in silence. None of it had bought respect. None of it had bought love. It had bought only contempt. That night she did not sleep. She wandered the halls of Hollowcliff, the portraits of her ancestors watching her from the walls. She felt their judgment, but she also felt their strength. She stopped before her husband's portrait again, his painted eyes steady, unwavering. "You were right," she whispered. "I should have seen it sooner." The sea roared outside, endless and merciless. Evelyn's decision formed as steadily as the tide carving the cliffs. Tomorrow she would act. Tomorrow she would sever the chains she had allowed them to fasten around her. But Evelyn did not know that her decision would spark a chain of events darker and more dangerous than she imagined. For Adrian and Selena were not people who accepted humiliation quietly. And the game they played would only grow more ruthless once the flow of money stopped. The night after the dinner stretched on, endlessly filled with the echo of Selena's mocking voice and Adrian's careless laugh. Hollowcliff Manor was silent, but alive with memory. The heavy beams creaked in the wind. The sea, hidden by darkness, roared against the cliffs as though trying to claw its way into the house. Evelyn lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to close her eyes. She felt no exhaustion, only a sharp awareness that kept her heart racing and her mind unwilling to rest. Her thoughts circled like a storm. The humiliation at dinner was not just a careless insult. It was the unveiling of a truth she had tried to deny for years. She had not been family to Adrian and Selena. She had been their safety net, their financier, their justification for living a life they could not afford. Every time she signed a check or agreed to cover a bill, she had placed another stone on her own back. Now the weight threatened to crush her entirely. At 3 a.m, she rose, unable to bear the silence of her own thoughts any longer. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and padded barefoot across the cold floors to her study. The lamp on the desk flickered to life, casting a weak pool of light across stacks of bank statements, letters, and ledgers. For years she had kept these documents in neat order, though she rarely allowed herself to read them closely. She knew what they contained, the slow draining of her savings, the endless list of indulgences that had been disguised as needs. But tonight Evelyn did not look away. She opened the drawers and spread the papers across the desk. The numbers glared back at her rows of transactions that told the story of her slow undoing. Rent payments for Adrian's penthouse, thousands for Selena's clothing, flights to foreign cities where Evelyn had never been invited. Even the down payment for their luxury car sitting in Adrian's name, but built on Evelyn's years of careful saving. The storm outside rattled the windows. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the pen on her desk. Each crash of thunder seemed to punctuate her growing resolve. Enough. Enough of the endless sacrifices. Enough of being treated like an afterthought in her own home. Enough of watching her son throw her love back at her in the form of contempt. Her decision was not made in anger alone. It came with the clarity of someone who finally saw the truth. She moved to the small safe behind the bookshelf, her hand steady as she turned the dial. Inside were the folders of account information, the extra cards she had signed over to Adrian and Selena, the details of the savings account they had always called the emergency fund. She set them on the desk and began to work. The phone trembled in her hand as she called the first bank. The voice of the clerk was polite but surprised, as Evelyn calmly requested the cancellation of every supplementary card attached to her name. 5 cards in total, all used regularly, all now nothing more than useless plastic. Evelyn's voice did not waver. She gave her confirmations, answered the security questions, and with each completed step, she felt lighter. Next came the emergency account. She instructed the bank to close it, transferring the balance back into her private account. That account had always been a trick. It was never for true emergencies. It had been for restaurant bills, designer jewelry, nights out with friends. She had known it deep down, but tonight she admitted it fully. That account was not her gift. It was her burden. And she had carried it long enough. By the time she reset every password, installed 2-factor authentication, and secured her finances fully in her own name, the storm had begun to fade. The house, too, seemed quieter, as though it approved of her decision. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, exhausted but unbroken. She poured herself a small glass of brandy from the cabinet, something she had not allowed herself in years. The amber liquid burned warmly down her throat, but it was not the drink that gave her comfort. It was the taste of freedom. At 6 a.m, she walked to the drawing room and opened the heavy curtains. Dawn spilled across the cliffs, painting the sea with silver light. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt at peace. She sank into her armchair with a cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She knew the storm was not over. In fact, it was only beginning. Adrian would soon discover what she had done, and his desperation would come crashing through her life like the waves against the cliffs. But Evelyn was ready. At exactly 9:15, the silence of the house was broken by the shrill ring of the telephone. Evelyn did not move at first. She let it ring, savoring the sound, savoring the knowledge that she held the power now. On the 4th ring, she lifted the receiver, her voice calm, almost cold. On the other end came Adrian's voice, sharp with panic. "Mother," he gasped, "why are all the cards blocked? We are at the rooftop restaurant with Selena's mother, and none of them work. Do you understand what is happening? Everyone is staring at us. We cannot pay the bill. What have you done?" The desperation in his voice filled Evelyn with a strange satisfaction. The son who had laughed at her humiliation was now trapped in his own. The very restaurant where she had never been welcome was now the stage for his disgrace. She held the phone steady, letting him pour out his panic, her silence pressing on him harder than any words could. And then, with the calmness of someone who has finally reclaimed her life, Evelyn prepared to speak. What she would say next would not only cut off the lifeline he had always taken for granted, but would open a battle between them that neither had ever imagined. The voice on the other end of the line was frantic, broken by fear and humiliation. Adrian, always so composed in public, sounded like a boy cornered with no escape. Evelyn let him speak, let him rattle on about the waiter standing impatiently with the check, about the stares of other diners, about how Selena's mother Claudette was growing restless. His words tumbled together in a desperate rush, but underneath all of it, Evelyn heard the real fear. Not hunger, not debt, but shame. Adrian was terrified of looking small in front of others. Evelyn sipped her coffee slowly before she answered. Her voice was steady, almost soothing, though her words were as sharp as the waves crashing below Hollowcliff. "The cards are blocked because I chose to block them," she said. "I will no longer fund your life, Adrian. Not your dinners, not your trips, not your illusions. That time is over." On the other end there was a pause, then an explosion of disbelief. "Are you mad, Mother?" Do you realize where I am? Claudette is sitting across from me. She expects a celebration. What am I supposed to tell her that my own mother left me stranded? Do you want us humiliated like beggars? Evelyn's eyes narrowed. I want you to understand, Adrian, that I am not your bank. I am not your safety net. I am your mother, and I am tired of being treated as less than human. Silence followed. She imagined him clutching the phone, his face pale, Selena's sharp eyes drilling into him as the waiter hovered at their table. The entire rooftop restaurant must have been watching by then, whispering behind their napkins. Adrian tried again, his voice lower, pleading, "Just for today, Mother. Just this once. Reactivate the cards, and we will talk later. I promise we will change. I swear it." Evelyn laughed quietly, a sound that startled even her. It was not a laugh of amusement, but of disbelief, a bitter laugh that came from 10 years of broken promises. How many times have I heard those words? Just once more. Just this last time. Do you know how many last times I have already paid for? She could almost hear his composure cracking, the panic rising like water in a sinking ship. Claudette must have noticed her eyes narrowing as she realized something was wrong. Selena, she imagined, was already inventing excuses, her charm fraying at the edges. Adrian's voice trembled. "We cannot just walk out of here, Mother. Do you understand? People will see. They will talk. We cannot live with this shame." Evelyn's tone grew colder. "Then you finally know how I have lived for years. Invisible in my own home, mocked in front of guests, laughed at when your wife called me nothing more than a purse. You care about shame, Adrian. I have carried it for a decade. Now it is your turn." On the other end came the sound of muffled voices, Selena whispering angrily, Claudette asking sharp questions. The waiter must have returned, pen tapping against the checkbook, waiting for payment. Adrian's desperation thickened. "Please," he begged. "Selena's mother is here. She will think we are ruined. We will be the laughingstock of the entire city. Do you want that on your conscience?" Evelyn's reply was swift. "What I want, Adrian, is a son who values me. What I want is respect. But you gave me none of that. Not last night, not for years. And I will not buy it with another dollar." For a moment she thought he might shout again, might try to break her with his fury. But instead his voice collapsed into something smaller, weaker. "What do you expect us to do, Mother? Wash dishes? Beg the staff? This is impossible. Nothing is impossible," Evelyn said softly. "You are 36 years old. Your wife is 33. You are not helpless children. Solve it." She ended the call. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed the receiver back on its stand, not from fear but from the rush of adrenaline. She had just cut the cord that had bound her for years, and though she knew a storm was coming, she felt strangely free. She imagined the scene at the rooftop restaurant. Adrian shifting in his chair, sweat beading on his brow. Selena snapping at him in hushed tones, her polished facade cracking. Claudette regal and cold, opening her purse with visible distaste to save them from utter humiliation. The waiter finally relieved as crisp bills settled the matter. The stares, the whispers, the silent judgment from every corner of the glittering room. By the time she set her cup down, Evelyn knew her son's life had already changed. His kingdom of illusions had crumbled in front of the very people he most wished to impress, and she had been the one to strike the first blow. But Evelyn also knew the battle was far from over. Adrian and Selena would not accept this defeat quietly. Their pride had been wounded in public, their lifestyle threatened in private. They would come to Hollowcliff Manor, she was certain, and they would not come with humility. They would come with anger, with demands, perhaps even with threats. The sea outside pounded the cliffs as if echoing her thoughts. Hollowcliff had withstood centuries of storms, and now Evelyn would have to withstand her own. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and prepared herself. Later that evening, long after the sun had set and the sea had turned black beneath the moon, Evelyn heard the unmistakable sound of tires on gravel. Headlights swept across the front lawn, cutting through the darkness. Doors slammed. Footsteps pounded toward the heavy oak door. The siege of Hollowcliff had begun. The pounding on the oak door shook Hollowcliff to its very foundations. Evelyn sat in the back garden, cloaked in shadows, listening as her son's voice thundered through the storm of silence. "Mother, open this door, we need to talk." His voice, usually smooth and measured, now carried an edge of desperation. The sound echoed across the stone walls of the manor, carried on the night air like a warning. Evelyn did not move. She sat still in her chair, the damp scent of the sea drifting over the cliffs, her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling tea. The birds had gone quiet, as if they too sensed that something unnatural was unfolding. Then came Selena's voice, sharper, harsher. "Evelyn, stop this nonsense. You made us look like fools today." Everyone was staring. "Do you have any idea what you have done to us?" Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. She could see them clearly in her mind. Adrian pacing, his face flushed with humiliation. Selena, her golden mask stripped away, revealing the temper that had always simmered beneath. She imagined Claudette's icy disapproval still hanging over them, her hand digging into her purse to rescue them from utter disgrace. That humiliation had been a dagger to Selena's pride, and now she was thrusting the blade back at Evelyn. The pounding on the door grew louder, fists then feet hammering against the wood. The oak groaned but held its strength, a testament to Evelyn's late husband, who had chosen it decades earlier, saying, "This door will outlast storms and men alike." "Mother, we know you are inside," Adrian shouted, his voice cracking. "Your car is here. Your lights are on. Stop acting like a child. Come and face us." Evelyn sipped her tea, her lips curling into a faint smile. Face them, as if she were the one who had sinned, as if she owed them an explanation for choosing to protect herself after years of being stripped bare. No, she thought. Tonight they would face the silence of her refusal. The knocking stopped for a moment. She could hear the sound of hurried whispers, their voices sharp and tense. They were planning recalibrating their attack. Evelyn had watched them play this game for years, cycles of anger, guilt, and persuasion. She knew what would come next, and she was right. Selena's voice rose again, softened, now dripping with sugar. "Evelyn, darling, we understand. You are upset. Yesterday's words may have sounded harsh, but you know me. I was only joking. You know how women speak when we are among friends. Please open the door. Let us talk like a family." Evelyn let the words hang in the air, false sweetness wrapped around poisoned barbs. Selena's voice had always been a performance, switching from fury to charm in the span of a heartbeat. Evelyn had fallen for it too many times. Not tonight. Adrian tried next, his voice gentler, almost broken. "Mother, please. I know we hurt you. We can fix this, but blocking the card solves nothing. It only makes things worse. Just open the door and let us talk. We need you." Evelyn felt her jaw tighten. "We need you. Not we love you. Not we are sorry." It was always about need. Always about what they could take. Another round of pounding shook the door. Evelyn imagined the wood splintering under their fists, though she knew it would hold. She rose at last, not to answer, but to move quietly through the house. The floorboards creaked under her feet as she walked to the side window. Pulling back the curtain just slightly, she looked out. There they were, Adrian, his face pale in the moonlight, sweat gleaming at his temples. Selena, her expression a mask of rage and calculation, their eyes locked on her shadow. "There you are," Selena cried, her voice cutting through the night. "Finally, now open the door, Evelyn. Let us talk." Evelyn held her gaze for a long, unbroken moment. Then, with deliberate calm, she closed the curtain again. The sound of Selena's shriek echoed across the lawn, followed by more furious pounding on the glass. Coward Selena shouted, "You made us look like beggars today. Do you know what people are saying? Do you know what you have done to your own family?" Evelyn walked back to her chair in the garden, her steps unhurried. The sea roared beneath the cliffs as if applauding her refusal. She sat down, picked up her tea once more, and listened as their voices rose in frustration. Time dragged on. The pounding slowed, replaced by the murmur of urgent whispers. Through the walls she could catch fragments of their words. Plans, threats, pleas. At one point, she heard Selena hiss that they should call a locksmith, force the door open. Adrian's voice, lower, warned her it would be breaking and entering. Even in their desperation, they feared the law. Evelyn smiled faintly. Hollowcliff was holding firm both in stone and in spirit. After what felt like hours, the noise began to fade. Doors slammed, Tires crunched over gravel. The car's engine roared into the night, carrying them away for now. But Evelyn knew this was not the end. The siege had not been broken. It had only just begun. She had seen the fury in Selena's eyes, the desperation in Adrian's. They would be back. They would come armed with sharper words, more cunning lies, and perhaps allies who would strike where fists and screams had failed. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, the wind tugging at her hair, her eyes fixed on the black horizon where the sea met the sky. A battle line had been drawn, and Hollowcliff was now a fortress. She would not yield it again. But as the night deepened, a sliver of unease crept into her thoughts. They had left, yes, but she could still feel their presence like a shadow at her back. And for the first time she wondered just how far her son and his wife would go to reclaim the power she had taken from them. The storm had passed. But Evelyn knew with a terrible certainty that the darkest clouds were still gathering. The morning after the siege, Hollowcliff Manor was unusually still. The sea mist clung to the windows and gulls cried overhead as if mocking the silence. Evelyn moved through the kitchen, slowly setting out her teapot, her china cup, her breakfast tray. Though her body was calm, her mind was sharp alert to the echoes of last night. She could still hear the pounding fists on the oak door, Selena's shrieks, Adrian's desperate pleas. She expected them to return at any moment, but the first knock that day came from someone else entirely, a softer, measured knock, not frantic like the night before, but insistent, polite, almost rehearsed. Evelyn's stomach tightened. She walked to the front hall and peered through the peephole. On her porch stood Claudette, Selena's mother. Tall, immaculately dressed in a slate-gray coat and pearls, she looked less like a guest and more like a lawyer arriving for an appointment. Her expression was fixed in that practiced smile Evelyn knew too well, polished, courteous, and completely devoid of warmth. Evelyn hesitated, then opened the door just enough to speak. "Claudette." Claudette replied smoothly, stepping forward as though she expected to be invited in. "I think we need to talk." Reluctantly, Evelyn let her inside. Claudette's perfume drifted through the air, sharp and expensive, filling the hallway like smoke. They sat in the drawing room where the morning light filtered through high windows, illuminating dust motes that seemed to dance nervously between them. Claudette did not waste time. "I heard about yesterday's little scene," she said, her tone light, but her eyes cold. "Adrian and Selena told me what happened at the restaurant. I must say it sounds very unlike you." Evelyn folded her hands in her lap. "Unlike me to what?" "To cut them off so suddenly," Claudette replied. "To embarrass your own son and daughter-in-law in front of me, in front of society. It feels extreme." Evelyn kept her voice steady. "What feels extreme to me, Claudette, is being mocked in my own home. What feels extreme is being treated as a wallet instead of a mother." Claudette's smile tightened. "You are exaggerating. Selena tells me she made a small joke that you misunderstood. You know how women chatter among themselves. Surely you do not intend to destroy your family over one careless comment." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "It was no joke. It was the truth, and I am done ignoring it." For the first time, Claudette's polished mask cracked. A flicker of irritation passed over her face before she smoothed it away. "Evelyn, I respect your independence, but let me be frank. Adrian and Selena are young. They are building a future. They need your support. Is that not what family does?" "Family does not drain a person dry," Evelyn said quietly. "Family does not laugh when you are humiliated." Claudette leaned forward, her voice lower, her eyes hard. "And what do you think people will say, Evelyn, when they hear you abandoned your own child at a restaurant? Do you think the whispers will be kind? Do you think the church, the neighbors, your own relatives will approve?" Evelyn felt the pressure in those words. Guilt, shame, reputation. Claudette wielded them like weapons, but she did not flinch. "Let them whisper," she said. "I would rather be whispered about than used." Claudette sat back, studying her as though she were a puzzle refusing to fit together. Then she changed tactics. Her voice softened, almost motherly. "Evelyn, I worry about you. This behavior is not rational. Blocking accounts in the middle of the night, isolating yourself, refusing to see your son. Some might say you are not thinking clearly." There it was, the hidden blade. Evelyn's chest tightened, but she held Claudette's gaze. "Are you suggesting I am unwell? Claudette tilted her head, feigning innocence. "I am suggesting that Adrian and Selena are concerned. If this continues, they might be forced to seek legal remedies. Guardianship, perhaps. It would be tragic if people thought you could no longer manage your own affairs." The room grew colder. Evelyn heard the sea battering the cliffs outside, the waves crashing like distant drums. She knew what Claudette was saying. If Evelyn did not give them back their access, they would try to strip her of her independence altogether. Slowly, Evelyn rose from her chair. Her voice was calm, but her words cut like steel. "Claudette, I met with my lawyer yesterday. He assures me that protecting my finances from exploitation is not incompetence, it is prudence. So if your daughter and my son wish to challenge me, let them try. They will lose." For the first time, Claudette's composure faltered. A flicker of anger crossed her eyes, quickly smoothed over by a brittle smile. "You are making a mistake, Evelyn. A family war does not benefit anyone." "There is no war," Evelyn said firmly. "There is only a woman who has finally chosen to defend herself." She walked Claudette to the door without another word. The older woman paused on the porch, her smile gone now, her face set in a mask of warning. "Think carefully, Evelyn. No one wants this to end badly." The car pulled away, its engine fading into the distance, leaving Hollowcliff once again cloaked in silence. But it was not a peaceful silence. Evelyn knew what Claudette's visit meant. The siege was shifting. The next assault would not be with fists or screams. It would come with lawyers, with whispers, with threats designed to unravel her sanity. As she closed the door, Evelyn felt a tremor of fear. How far would they go? How much would they risk to keep control of her wealth? The thought lingered as she returned to her study, her mind racing. And then, as if the night wished to remind her she was never truly alone, she found an envelope on her desk. It had not been there that morning. Its flap was sealed, the paper thick, the handwriting unfamiliar. With steady fingers, Evelyn tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing only one sentence: "They will not stop. Be careful whom you trust." Evelyn stared at the words as the sea wind howled through the cracks of the manor. A chill slid down her spine. Who had left it? A neighbor, a stranger, someone inside her own family. The web around her was tightening, and she was no longer sure where the next thread would come from. Evelyn sat in her study long after Claudette's car disappeared down the lane, the letter still trembling in her hand. The words on the page felt heavier than the ink that formed them. "They will not stop. Be careful whom you trust." She had no idea who had left the message, nor how it had slipped into her house unseen. But one thing was clear. Someone else knew the truth of Adrian and Selena's intentions, and someone thought she needed a warning. The room around her seemed to shift as she placed the letter on her desk. The storm outside had passed, but inside Hollowcliff, a new storm was gathering, one born of secrets and revelations. Evelyn had spent years deliberately ignoring the full weight of her sacrifices, convincing herself that money was simply a way of showing love. But now she saw those years for what they truly were, a long, slow draining of her life's work. She pulled the drawers open and laid out her records. Bank statements, receipts, slips of paper she had filed away without ever allowing herself to examine too closely. The pile grew until it covered nearly the entire desk. For the first time in years, Evelyn did not look away. The numbers told a devastating story. Over the past 5 years alone, she had given away more than $120,000. Rent for Adrian's penthouse, vacations to Paris, Rome, and Marrakesh, jewelry, tailored suits, private clubs, and so-called emergencies that always ended in expensive restaurants. The list stretched on each entry like a knife, twisting deeper into her heart. Her hands shook as she tallied the sums. She had given away nearly half of her pension. And for what? To be laughed at in her own dining room. To be mocked as only good for paying. To be threatened with incompetence by her son's mother-in-law. As her eyes scanned the charges, she found smaller recurring amounts she had never noticed. Streaming services she had never watched. Gym memberships she had never used. Subscription boxes and luxury magazines she had never ordered. All of them linked to cards under her name, used freely by Adrian and Selena as if her accounts were theirs. Evelyn pushed back from the desk, her chair scraping across the floorboards. She stood before the tall mirror by the window staring at her reflection. Her hair was silver, her face lined with years of sacrifice, but her eyes burned with something she had not seen in a long time: clarity. She whispered to herself, "I was not their mother. I was their bank." The truth settled over her like a cloak, heavy but freeing. She had been living inside an illusion, and now that illusion had shattered. For the first time in decades, she was seeing her life clearly. She turned back to the desk and opened another drawer, pulling out a thin folder bound in leather. Inside was her will written years earlier, when she still believed she was securing the future of a loving family. Ryan, that bright little boy who had once curled against her side to listen to stories, was listed as the sole heir. Every penny, every possession, every brick of Hollowcliff Manor was to pass to him. Evelyn sat back down the folder heavy in her lap. She read the words again and again until the ink seemed to blur. How could she leave everything to a man who had already consumed half of it before she was gone? How could she gift her life's work to someone who saw her only as a resource? No, that would end here. At dawn, she called her lawyer, Mr. Vaylor, his voice groggy but attentive on the line. "I want to amend my will," she told him. "It is urgent." He agreed to see her that afternoon. Until then, Evelyn prepared. She gathered every receipt, every bank statement, every subscription and charge. She wanted him to see the pattern to understand the depth of the exploitation. When she laid it out for him later that day, his brows rose slightly, but he said nothing except "Mrs. Cross, I see this more often than you think. You are not alone." For hours they drafted a new plan. Half of her estate would go to charities that served those truly in need. A portion would go to her sister Isolde, who had never once asked her for a dime. And Adrian, he would not be cut off entirely, but his inheritance would no longer be guaranteed. His share would come only if he demonstrated independence for a set number of years. Until then, it would remain locked away. When she signed the new documents, Evelyn felt a strange lightness. It was not revenge. It was not cruelty. It was justice for herself, for the life she had built, for the years she had sacrificed in silence. That night she returned to Hollowcliff with the papers safe in her bag. The sea wind battered the cliffs, but Evelyn felt stronger than the storm. She poured herself a glass of wine and allowed herself a luxury she had not known in years: peace. But peace never lingered long in Hollowcliff. As she sat by the fire, a car's headlights swept across the window. Tires crunched against the gravel. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She had expected Adrian and Selena to return, but not so soon. The knock at the door was firm, deliberate, not frantic like before. She opened it cautiously. There on her porch stood Claudette once again, her smile sharpened into something more dangerous. "Good evening, Evelyn," she said. "We should speak again." This time frankly. And in that moment, Evelyn knew the battle was far from over. The money was only part of the struggle now. Claudette and her daughter wanted more than wealth. They wanted control. Claudette's warning still lingered in the air long after she had gone. Evelyn sat by the fire, the documents from her lawyer resting safely in her desk, but unease gnawed at her like the tide eating away the cliffs below. She had taken her first steps toward freedom, but she knew the battle had only deepened. The following morning, Evelyn rose before dawn. The sea mist was heavy, pressing against the windows as though trying to seep inside. She brewed her coffee and sat at the kitchen table staring at the horizon. She expected another knock, another demand, another attack. Instead, her phone rang. The name on the screen was Adrian. She let it ring 3 times before answering. His voice was unsteady, nothing like the confident son she once knew. "Mother," he said quietly, "can I come by alone?" There was a pause as if he feared she would hang up. Evelyn hesitated, then replied, "Yes, alone." When Adrian arrived, he was not the polished figure she was used to seeing. His hair was disheveled, his suit wrinkled, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. He stood in the doorway like a man half collapsed. "Mother," he began, his voice breaking, "I do not know what to do." Evelyn studied him in silence before motioning for him to sit. He slumped into a chair at the kitchen table, his hands trembling. "We are drowning," he confessed. "The bills are piling up. The rent is late. The car insurance, even the groceries. I do not know how to cover any of it without you." Evelyn folded her arms. You earn a salary, Adrian. Selena earns a salary. Why can you not live on that? He shook his head. You do not understand. We have expenses, obligations, luxuries, Evelyn corrected. Tell me, Adrian. How much did you spend on restaurants last month? How many nights out? How many streaming services? How many clubs? Have you ever once made a budget and lived within it? His silence was answer enough. Evelyn pressed on. You are 36 years old. You have had every advantage. Why are you sitting here like a man who cannot pay a single bill? Tears welled in his eyes. For the first time, Evelyn saw the truth beneath his pride. He was terrified, not just of losing money, but of losing the image he had built. He whispered, Selena expects a certain life. Her friends live a certain way. We cannot look poor. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice firm. And when did you consider my life, Adrian? When did you consider that I lived on beans and rice while you drank champagne? When did you think about my pressure, my sacrifices, my loneliness? He lowered his head. The silence stretched between them, until finally he whispered, I never thought of it that way. Evelyn's heart ached, but she did not let it weaken her. If you truly want to change, Adrian, start by paying for your own car insurance. That is where you begin. He nodded slowly, his face pale. For the first time in years, Evelyn sensed that her words had struck deeper than any check ever had. But later that evening, as she sat alone in the library, Evelyn received another call. This time it was from a mutual acquaintance in town, a woman who occasionally mingled with Selena's social circle. The voice on the line was cautious. Evelyn, she said, I should not be telling you this, but you deserve to know. Selena has debts, serious debts, not just rent and dinners. There are people in the city, people you do not want to cross, who have been financing her spending. She has kept it quiet, but they are circling. They will come collecting soon. Evelyn's blood ran cold. The letter she had found days earlier came back to her mind. They will not stop. Be careful whom you trust. Was this what the warning meant? That the danger extended beyond humiliation and manipulation into something darker, something that might drag Hollowcliff itself into ruin? She thanked the woman and ended the call, her hand trembling as she replaced the receiver. She stared into the fire, her thoughts spinning. Adrian's despair now made sense. He was not just frightened of shame. He was frightened of consequences he could not control. Selena had led them both into waters far deeper than Evelyn had ever suspected. That night, sleep eluded her. She walked the corridors of Hollowcliff, the portraits of her ancestors watching silently from the walls. The house itself seemed to breathe with her unease. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the shutters felt like a reminder that the shadows pressing against the manor were closing in. Near midnight, she returned to the garden. The cliffs were dark, the sea roaring endlessly below. She thought of Adrian as a child running barefoot across these lawns, laughing in the salt air. She thought of the boy she had loved and the man who now sat broken at her kitchen table. She whispered to the night, How far will you let this go, Selena? How far until you break us all? The only answer was the sea, relentless and merciless. When she returned inside, she found another envelope slipped beneath the front door. No name, no handwriting she recognized. Only a single line written across the page. The debts are not yours, but they will make them yours if you are not careful. Evelyn held the note in her hands, her pulse quickening. Whoever was leaving these messages knew more than she did. But were they a friend or another enemy? She sat in the silence of Hollowcliff, the firelight flickering against the walls, and realized the truth. This was no longer just about protecting her money. It was about protecting her life, her freedom, and perhaps even her safety. And though Adrian had begun to crumble, Evelyn knew Selena's mask had not yet fully fallen. When it did, the darkness beneath might prove more dangerous than anything she had yet faced. The sea was calm the next morning, but Hollowcliff Manor was not. Evelyn awoke with the uneasy sense that the house itself was holding its breath. The two warning notes lay side by side on her desk, their cryptic words staring back at her. Someone was watching someone who knew too much. The thought made her stomach tighten, yet it also sharpened her determination. She had faced storms before, and this one she would face head-on. She moved through the day with deliberate composure, cooking her breakfast, tending the roses in the overgrown garden, keeping her routines intact. But her eyes flicked often toward the windows, and her ears strained for sounds beyond the usual sigh of wind or call of gulls. That afternoon, as the tide rolled high, Evelyn stepped outside to fetch wood for the fire. That was when she saw it. The garden gate heavy iron that always screeched when moved stood ajar. Muddy footprints trailed from the path straight up to the side of the house. She froze, her heart thudding, the bundle of wood slipping from her hands. Someone had been here. Someone had walked the very grounds her husband once guarded with pride. Evelyn forced herself to follow the tracks, her slippers crunching over the gravel. They led to the side window of her study, the one where she often left the lamp burning late at night. The soil beneath the sill was disturbed, as if someone had stood there watching. She shivered. The thought of eyes fixed on her as she worked through her papers, as she spoke on the phone with her lawyer, as she read her warning notes, it made her skin prickle. But instead of panic, Evelyn felt a surge of resolve. They wanted to frighten her, to push her into surrender. She would not give them that satisfaction. She closed the gate, secured it with the old chain, and then double-checked every lock on the manor. Hollowcliff had weathered storms for centuries. Tonight it would become her fortress. Later, as dusk fell, she sat in the drawing room with the fire crackling. Her sister Isolde called from across the country, her voice warm and concerned. Evelyn told her only part of the truth, enough to assure her she was fine, but not enough to reveal the shadows circling the manor. Why worry Isolde when she had battles of her own to fight? The phone rang again just before nightfall. This time it was Adrian. His voice carried a brittle edge. "Mother, why are you doing this to us? Selena is beside herself. She says you are acting irrationally. She says you are being cruel." Evelyn listened, the flames reflecting in her eyes. "Cruel," she repeated softly. "Cruel is mocking your mother while she serves you dinner. Cruel is laughing as your wife calls her nothing more than a purse. Cruel is draining her savings while she eats alone in silence. If you want to speak of cruelty, Adrian, you must start with yourselves." Her son tried to argue, but his voice faltered. He begged again for her to reconsider. "Just one more time, Mother. Just until we are back on our feet." Evelyn cut him off. "You are not children learning to walk. You are grown adults who refuse to stand. No more." And she ended the call. The silence afterward was heavy, but Evelyn felt no guilt. For the first time, she felt the weight shifting off her shoulders and back onto the people who had carried none of it for far too long. That night, she could not sleep. The manor groaned under the wind, every sound magnified in her ears. Near midnight, she rose and walked the halls, a candle in her hand. The portraits of her ancestors watched her with stern approval, their painted eyes seeming to whisper encouragement. When she returned to the study, she found another envelope slid beneath the door. Her pulse quickened as she bent to pick it up. The same thick paper, the same careful script. This one read, "They will come at you with whispers first. When that fails, they will come with force." Evelyn lowered herself into her chair, the letter trembling in her hand. Whoever wrote these notes seemed to know the pattern of the game. Manipulation, intimidation, then something darker. She wondered again who the sender was. A neighbor, someone close to Selena, or perhaps someone tied to those mysterious debts she had just learned about. Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant crunch of tires on gravel. Headlights flashed briefly across the walls before vanishing. She held her breath. The car lingered for a moment in the lane, then pulled away. Was it Adrian circling like a wolf, or someone else entirely? Evelyn leaned back, clutching the letter to her chest. Fear curled in her stomach, but alongside it something stronger burned. Determination. She would not surrender. She would not retreat. Hollowcliff was hers, her life was hers, and she would defend both. The sea thundered against the cliffs, relentless and eternal. Evelyn knew she would need that same relentlessness in the days to come, for if the notes were right, the whispers had only just begun. The force would come next, and when it did, she would be ready. The days that followed were unlike any Evelyn had known in years. The whispers, the pounding fists, the threats, none of them returned in the same furious form. Instead, a strange quietness settled over Hollowcliff Manor. The silence was not without tension. Evelyn felt the weight of unseen eyes on her, the sense of danger pressing in at the edges of her world. Yet beneath it something else stirred. A calm, a freedom, a possibility that she had not dared to imagine. Adrian did not return immediately. Selena vanished from sight as well, no longer calling or shouting through the door. Evelyn suspected they were nursing their wounds, their pride shattered by the humiliation at the restaurant and the locked gates of Hollowcliff. She did not trust the silence, but she welcomed the space it gave her to breathe. One morning she awoke to a bright, salt-filled breeze drifting through the windows. She dressed in a simple dress, pulled her shawl over her shoulders, and walked down into town. It had been years since she allowed herself the indulgence of choosing her own pleasures. That day she entered a small cafe by the harbor, a place she had always admired but never visited. She ordered the most expensive breakfast on the menu, a dish she once would have denied herself for fear of wasting money needed for Adrian and Selena. She ate slowly, savoring every bite. For the first time in so long, she was not thinking about someone else's bills, someone else's demands, or someone else's expectations. She thought only of herself. Later, she met her lawyer again to finalize the changes to her will. Adrian's inheritance would not vanish completely, but it would now come with conditions. He would receive only a small portion at first. If he proved himself financially independent for 2 years, more would follow. If he sustained it for 5, he would eventually inherit what remained. If he failed, the bulk of her estate would pass to charities that would use it for those who truly needed it. The plan was not revenge. It was a lesson written into law, a final gift that could not be twisted into entitlement. As she left the law office, Evelyn felt lighter. She was no longer the frightened widow clinging to her role as a provider. She was a woman reclaiming her life. 2 weeks later, Adrian appeared at Hollowcliff once more. But this time he did not arrive with Selena. He came alone, driving an older car that rattled as it pulled into the driveway. He stepped out in plain clothes, his face thinner, his expression more subdued. When Evelyn opened the door, he did not shout or demand. He held his cap in his hands, his eyes lowered like a schoolboy caught in shame. "Mother," he said softly, "I wanted to tell you what we have done." Evelyn studied him carefully, searching for signs of manipulation, but his voice carried no arrogance, no rehearsed charm. He looked tired but changed. "We left the penthouse," he admitted. "We could not afford it. We have moved into a smaller apartment, half the price. Selena has taken extra work. I canceled every subscription and card I did not need. I even sat down and made a budget for the first time in my life." Evelyn listened, her face calm. She did not let herself smile, not yet. Adrian swallowed. "It is hard, harder than I thought, but for the first time I am paying my own bills with my own money, and it feels different. It feels right." For the first time in years, Evelyn saw not the entitled man her son had become, but a glimpse of the boy she had once raised. A boy who had been lost in illusions, now forced to face the truth. They sat together in the drawing room, the fire flickering between them. Adrian spoke more openly than she had ever heard him, admitting the weight of his pride, the trap of keeping up appearances, the fear that had driven him to cling to her money. Evelyn listened in silence, her heart aching but steady. At last he looked at her and asked, "Do you think we can have a normal relationship again? Not mother and bank, just mother and son." Evelyn reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "That depends on you, Adrian. A normal relationship cannot be built on what you take. It must be built on who you are." He nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "Then I will try, truly this time." That evening, after Adrian left, Evelyn stepped out into the garden. The sea stretched wide and endless, the horizon glowing gold under the setting Sunday. For the first time in years, she felt not like a prisoner within Hollowcliff, but its rightful mistress. The house was no longer a cage. It was her fortress, her sanctuary, her home. The notes, the threats, the shadows, they had not broken her. They had made her stronger. She knew challenges would come again. Selena was not gone forever, and Claudette's ambitions were not easily silenced. But Evelyn no longer feared them. She had found her voice, her power, her independence, and that was something no storm could take away. As night fell over the cliffs, Evelyn lit a single candle in the window, a quiet beacon against the dark. It was not a signal for help, but a declaration of strength. Hollowcliff would endure, and so would she. This story is about more than money. It is about dignity, boundaries, and the courage to break free from exploitation, even when it comes from those closest to us. Evelyn's journey reminds us that love without respect is not love at all, and that enabling others can destroy both them and ourselves. True family is not measured in dollars, but in care, gratitude, and mutual respect. Sometimes saying no is the most powerful act of love we can give. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful life stories that inspire, challenge, and resonate. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life.